Anyway, Brian played a key role in Kirkley Hall College, Northumberland College now. Was one of those chaps that I worked very closely with. I spent some time at the college myself, and then I was a proficiency test examiner to examine students, and Brian was feeding me these students to examine. It's a fascinating experience when you're testing them on practical subjects and whether they were good enough or not. And you had to set all your prejudices aside and not sort of fail those that were covered in tattoos or rings or whatever. So it was an interesting period in my life when I worked very closely with the college and with Brian and his colleagues. So Brian doesn't need any introduction because he's one of our regularly coming up to the breakfast. And it's great, Brian, that you've taken on the speaking talk this morning. So over to you.
Thank you, Donald. Well, hello everybody. I really sincerely had hoped the fairground would start and that could at least either be too noisy and I couldn't carry on. Because I really felt quite apprehensive about preparing for this talk. Donald approached me some time ago and asked if I would talk about my life and career and my faith. And with some hesitation I said yes, but as time has gone on, I felt more and more apprehensive about it, because to try and fit 84 years into a few minutes talk is profoundly difficult. And you may say, well, if you talk about yourself, why do you need notes? But I've got some, I've got some prompts here to try and keep me on track as much as anything, so I hope you'll bear with me. And I've heard some wonderful talks here in the years I've been coming to these meetings, and I just have a horrible feeling that this will be a rather ordinary talk, and you'll go away thinking, oh, didn't think much of him. With a name like Japes as my surname, I feel I ought to explain a little bit about my ancestry, shall we say. I'm not a great one for researching ancestry, but my father, and subsequently my brother, who's 2 or 3 years older than me, have done quite a bit. And the name Japes apparently originates from the Huguenot people who used to be very active as Protestant people in Central Europe. And in the 16th and 17th centuries, they were severely persecuted by the Roman Catholics, and they fled to all sorts of parts, including England. And that's probably where I come from, so to speak. My most recent ancestry, which links perhaps to that a little bit, is that quite a few of them reputedly fled and became market gardeners in Kent. So that's the nearest to agriculture in my background that I've ever been able to trace. So I was born in 1938, a year or so before the Second World War started. And a lot of my early memories, of course, are prompted a little bit by family anecdotes that arose over the years. I can remember going to school in my early year at school, wearing a Mickey Mouse, at least not necessarily wearing it, but having to go through gas practices wearing my Mickey Mouse gas mask. I can remember being down the road on a little 3-wheel bicycle when the air raid siren went, and would you believe I pedalled so furiously back home I must have either agitated a dog that was probably frightened more by the air raid siren than I was, ran out and bit me on the leg. So that's a lasting memory. But quite genuinely, until I was probably 40 or 50 years old, if ever I heard an air raid siren of the wailing type, it sent goosebumps down my back. I don't think I've had that experience perhaps very recently, but it lasted for a very long time, just showing to me how those early memories can impact upon one. My parents were Methodists. I am a Methodist today, and to that extent I've been a Methodist all my life, but I've wavered, particularly in my early years and my teens particularly, which I'll come to. My father was a petroleum chemist. He worked for Shell all his life, and during the war he actually was classed as having a reserve occupation, and in fact he was trained to identify poisonous gases, and spent quite a lot of the war on shifts on top of Shell Mac's house in central London, effectively watching for incendiary bombs, but supposedly being prepared to identify poison gases, which of course never actually impacted on London during the war years. I have recollections of the war where I remember my brother and I, we used to sleep under the stairs during the war itself. We each had a bunk. my bunk became a bookcase, and it's only a few years ago I actually got rid of it. It did go into the garage as a storage for all sorts of bits for a long time after it was a bookcase. But my parents used to sleep on our dining room. We had a steel Morrison table shelter. I'm using some of these expressions because there might even be some people as old as me who remember these sort of things. And that was considered more secure than under the stairs. And so when there actually was an air raid, my brother and I used to be taken out from under the stairs and put with my mother, if Dad was out on duty, put in the Morrison table shelter. A V1 hit the end of our road where I lived. That was the nearest we actually came to being, in any sense, you might say, at danger. It buckled our front door, I do remember, and put a window out. But it actually demolished quite a lot of houses at the bottom of the road. And it was only when I became older and realised the significance of that sort of thing that the war really came home to me and what it was doing to people. I think it was 1944, my dad was promoted to chief chemist at the Stanlow refinery, which is at Ellesmere Port. In those days it was classed as Cheshire, but it's now part of Merseyside. And so we moved north. There wasn't a house for us. We originally, when we first moved north, we lived in a hotel on the Wirral. I suppose we were there for about 6 months, if I'm not mistaken. And then we moved to a company house that was actually next door to the refinery, so it was walking distance for Dad to go to work. But it was a pretty remote place for a child. Fortunately, it was a little community and there were other children I could play with. But there was no church anywhere near. There was a parish church in Ince, which was a few miles away. But I didn't go to Sunday school in those days. But we subsequently moved to a house more centrally in the Wirral. For those of you who know, it was technically in Eastham. And our nearest church was only a few hundred yards away in the other direction. And it was Bromborough Methodist Church, where my parents went. And of course then they thought, oh well, we'll send the boys to Sunday school. And I used to loathe it. It was a penance, it really was. And I couldn't really understand it. You'll understand that I hadn't found God at all at that time. I went to school in Chester. I was privileged. My senior school years were spent at the King's School in Chester. In those days, the King's School was built onto the cathedral, virtually. I think the stonework literally was part of the cathedral on one end of it. But it was a very old-fashioned school, but a very good school, very academically orientated. I don't know how, but I got actually a scholarship to attend. I can't believe how, but anyway, I must have passed some examinations. My brother was at the same school a few years ahead of me. We used to have to travel by bus to our playing fields, which were outside Chester. I was a keen footballer and more especially cricket player, a sport I continued much longer in my life later on. As I said, we attended the local Methodist Church, and Sunday school was something I was sent to. In my teen years, it was possibly when I discovered girls. I realised that at the church I was attending there was a Christian Endeavour group, which was predominantly people between, I think, the ages of about 15, 16 up to about 25. I don't even know whether there was a limit. Christian Endeavour is an organisation which is international, and many of you may know more about it than I do today, because I hear very little about it now, but I have looked on the internet, and it still functions. The significant thing about Christian Endeavour to me, apart from meeting girls, and my first girlfriend was a member of that group, was that we had to take a pledge. You took a pledge as an ordinary member, and of course that's how you started. But the significant pledge was one you took after perhaps a year or so of membership of Christian Endeavour, which was described as the pledge for active members. And I wrote it down here because I thought it was worth quoting to you. The active pledge is, I promise to be true to all my duties, to be present at and to take some part aside from singing in every Christian Endeavour meeting unless hindered by some reason which I can conscientiously give to my Lord and Master Jesus Christ. Now, at the time, I don't know that pledge meant an awful lot to me, but the impact of it, I think, came to me significantly later in my life. And I would still say today that I like to base my life on something that that pledge indicates. I have always believed, well, since I had a mature enough mind to think about these sort of things, that lay ministry in the church is just as important as ordained ministry. And I don't mean to offend any ordained people who are in this room this morning or any others you may know, but I do feel that lay ministry is important. It's very different, obviously, to ordained ministry, but I think it's very important for people to be part of God's church and not just go to church. And that's, again, something I've tried to base my life upon. It was probably about the same time I started going to Christian Endeavour. I was looking ahead in years and realised that national service was looming, not very far ahead. And for reasons best known to history, I didn't like the idea of joining the army, and I thought I'd far rather be in the RAF. So, with that rather selfish thing in mind, I joined the Air Training Corps. I used to go to the Air Training Corps at Hooton Park, which is a working RAF station at there, 3 or 4 miles. It's actually now where they make Vauxhall cars. It was actually the base of the Liverpool University Air Squadron, and Meteors were based there. And it was quite an exciting time, and it did a lot, I think, for my self-confidence at that particular time. I might also mention that those of you that know the mechanics, as it were, of the Methodist Church, we don't have a confirmation as such, although I think that is a word that's used. We received into membership of the Methodist Church. And I was going with a group of friends who were in the Christian Endeavour with me. I think there must have been about half a dozen of us to become members of the Methodist Church. And my father challenged me. He said, "Are you sure you're doing that for your own choice, or are you doing it because you're going in with a lot of mates?" And I thought about it, and I thought, well, perhaps I am being influenced more by the group momentum, as it were. And so I pulled out of the classes that were going to lead to membership. And in fact, I didn't get received into the Methodist Church until I was a student several years later. My school was not particularly good at careers advice. Perhaps no schools were in those days. I think it was my geography teacher who was the careers master. And originally I had intentions of perhaps joining the police force. That was a career that I rather fancied. But then I started looking at Shell magazines that Dad used to get provided with at home, and read quite a lot about the work that Shell were doing in the development of agricultural chemicals, fertilisers and these sort of things. And of course this was shortly after the war, you'll appreciate, when growing more food on the land that was available was one of the pressures at the time. And it seemed to me quite an interesting sort of work. And so I said to my careers master that I wanted a career in agriculture. And of course at that point it was more or less, well, you're on your own, Japes, you know. Don't know about that at all. I think with some, you might say...
Changed, Brian.
Sorry?
Nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed. I was determined to get a job on a farm anyway, so when I left school, I got a farm. It was actually 7 miles away from where I lived, and it was a bicycle ride further down into the Wirral. It was actually a farm owned by Lord Leverhulme of Lever Brothers fame. It was a mixed farm. There were dairy cows, pigs, poultry, calves, sheep, not many sheep interestingly, and of course quite a bit of arable. It was quite a big farm for that particular area and in that time. I think my family and friends thought I'd last about 5 days or 5 weeks at the most, but I was actually there for 15 months. And I got a tremendous range of experience with lots of different types of livestock and to a certain extent with arable farming. It was a 14-mile round trip, on a bike, push bike, which in those days was quite a strain to me throughout the year as well, and often working 7 days a week. I think my first pay, albeit would be for probably 5.5 days, I think was the standard week in those days, was less than £5. But of course that's moved on anyway, hasn't it? At the end of that year, I thought that rather than going on to higher education in agriculture, I would do a year at what was then called the Cheshire School of Agriculture, which I did. And so I did a certificate course there, which enhanced my practical skills, because it was partly practical, partly theory. and I then went on to Harper Adams College. In those days, courses were validated externally, but these days it's a university in its own right. And I'm pleased to say it's actually rated now the highest university, or the best university in the country for postgraduate employment, and I think the 5th in the country for graduate or for student satisfaction. It's nice to know that it's thriving still. I think it was while I was at Harper Adams doing the agricultural course there that I became interested in teaching. I think I realised that to get a job actually as a farm manager, or even more so to own or rent a farm, was probably outside my potential. And I thought, well, if these people are teaching me, there must be a demand for people to teach agriculture. And at that time, the only course that trained people with my sort of background in education was a course at the City of Worcester Training College, which was called the Rural Studies Professional Course, where people with agricultural or horticultural qualifications could go for 1 year to acquire a certificate in education. But of course it was intended for people to go on to teach rural studies, which was quite a significant subject in a lot of rural schools particularly. And so I did that course, although my intention was always to go into further education, at least in agricultural education, if I had that potential. Just check my notes, just keep me on course if you bear with me. Yes, while I was at Harper Adams, I met a student. He was actually a year older than me. He was a Methodist, and I suppose we probably met at church. John and I used to go to I think it was called the Student Christian Movement meetings in those days. But we found them a rather cliquey lot, to be honest, and John and I must have talked about this at some time, and we actually formed a little breakaway group, which I suppose you'd call a home group these days, although it was in the student bedroom. And we used to just meet half a dozen of us and talk about our faith and our problems and how we were struggling at some times, and that was really very helpful. It was mostly John's inspiration. He was a far more committed Christian at that time than I was, but his influence on my life has remained with me. John sadly died quite a few years ago now, but he was my best man. Sorry, initially I was his best man. He was married very soon after we finished our student days together, and he was my best man subsequently. Now, at the time we were at Worcester, I should explain, John failed his final exams at Harper Adams, which put him, he intended to resit a year later, which he did, which coincided with my finals. And in the meantime, he worked on a farm in Cheshire that was owned by a school linked to Northumberland, and I can't quite remember the details, but the headmaster of the school was somebody called John Waite, and that may have local influence that I'll come to explain. Towards the end of our course, John got a telephone call from John Waite to say that his brother in Northumberland, Edward Waite, at Hayden Bridge, where there was a school farm, was looking for somebody to act as a teacher of agriculture in the school and to manage the school farm, about 120 acres or so. John had already accepted a job, strangely on the Isle of Wight, and they said, well, is there anybody else down there with similar background to yourself who might be interested? And as they say, the rest is history. John mentioned my name. I came to Northumberland. County Hall for Northumberland in those days was right in the middle of Newcastle. But I remember being interviewed there, and the conversation took about half an hour, and 25 minutes of that was about cricket. Those of you that know Edward Waite, who died a long time ago, was the headmaster of the school at Hayden Bridge, and cricket was one of his great sort of interests. As so often in my life, when I look at the quirks of circumstantial change that happened at that time, I realise that God's hand was in this in some way. As I look back on it, I think, for all these things to have fallen into place in the way that they did, it wasn't just what might be called a coincidence. I think God did have some part to play in that. So I came to work at Hayden Bridge. It was a very interesting job, extremely demanding. I was the teacher in the school for about half normal teaching hours. I was managing the school farm. Fortunately, they did appoint a full-time farm worker, so I wasn't doing all of the manual work. And I was also a housemaster in the residential wing that the school had, which was a house called The Park, above where the school is now. And I should explain, in those days, the Hayden Bridge School was effectively the Shafto Trust School, which is a charitable trust, and is where the present junior school is. And the farm was spread around the village. I actually was working there and watched the building of what then became the Hayden Bridge Technical School, which now is the Hayden Bridge High School. It was quite an exciting sort of job. I made lots of mistakes. One particular one I mentioned, I'd only been there a few months, and I came to the mart here at Hexham and bought a dozen stirks to take back to the farm. And the tailboard of the wagon was dropped at the gate of the field, and these animals ran out into the field, and they just ran and ran and ran. They ran through the first fence, through the next fence, and ended up on a neighbour's farm. And that was a lesson I learned, that if you buy cattle that have been reared somewhere north of Hadrian's Wall, in a very open environment, you have to be a bit careful when you try to confine them in a relatively small grass field. 2 or 3 days later, the farmer next door, who fortunately was quite friendly and amused by the incident and probably thought I was a bit of an idiot, helped me bring the cattle back, and we repaired the fences. But you know, that's how life's lessons are learned, isn't it? I should mention perhaps that while I was at Hayden Bridge, I used to go to the little chapel at Hayden Bridge, where it is now, but a different building. It's been totally rebuilt. And I was coming out one day, and there was a young woman coming out about the same time as me, and the minister then, Reverend Derek Mailer, said to me, "Have you met Kathleen?" And I said, "Oh no," and this was Kathleen Wardle. And again, the rest is history. We became friendly, we became engaged, and we subsequently married in 1964. But that's jumping ahead a little bit. But that again was one of the coincidences or incidences in life that I look back on, obviously, with great pleasure. Sadly, John Wardle, Kath's, well, he was younger than Kath, but Kath's older of 2 brothers, died a couple of weeks ago, and his funeral's on Thursday. Some of you will know John, I know, and Howard was. I've been at Hayden Bridge 4.5 years, and although I was enjoying it immensely, it was pretty exhausting, and it wasn't quite the type of teaching that I had in mind. And an opportunity arose for which I applied and was appointed to a lecturer's post at the Nottinghamshire, again it was called the Farm Institute in those days, it's now called the Nottinghamshire College of Agriculture. In fact, it's not even that now, it's part of the Nottingham Trent University. That's again by the way. But anyway, I was appointed as a livestock lecturer there, and that was about 6 months before I was married. It was the beginning of 1964. I went there, and we were married the following August. Again, it was a slightly joint post. I was a warden in the college, looking after residential students. It was just trying to think how to. I was the first warden not to actually live in a single person's accommodation in the college. I had a house on the college estate, and that did create some issues with my colleagues, who used to think when I went home at 11 o'clock at night and spent the time overnight at home, they used to have to deal with any issues with students overnight, which was a bit of an issue at times. But I tried to compensate for that by doing other things like taking sports teams out to various activities and things of that sort. It was an interesting career there. I was, as well as lecturing, I was actually responsible for a 50-sow breeding herd of pigs and 20 suckler cows, beef cows. One or two incidents of the pig side might be of interest to you. I did a number of courses for mature farmers who were interested in perhaps taking over or starting pig enterprises. Ted Moult was a student of mine. He came across from Derbyshire. I'm sure that many of you remember Ted Moult, often on the television, quite a character. I also did one or two things for PIDA, the Pig Industry Development Authority. I ran one or two courses for them, and they had recently developed artificial insemination of pigs, which is quite different to that of cattle. They arranged to have their first public demonstration on the college farm where I was responsible for the pigs. And so when they said, is anybody prepared to do this themselves, a lot of the farmers looked at each other and they knew they had to get in amongst this sow and this sort of thing, and it was a bit grubby, so I was the only one with a pair of overalls on, I think. So I ended up doing it. So I think I can claim to be the first non-PIDA development staff member to have artificially inseminated a sow.
Did it work?
It did, remarkably. The problem was trying to get the pig and the sow at the right stage of its cycle, so that actually would be right on the day, but it was. But the most amusing thing that happened subsequently, because we decided we ought perhaps to follow this up by using AI with some of our sows. We didn't use it extensively, we had 2 or 3 boars already of our own. But it used to come by rail and used to be dropped off at Newark Station. And they would ring me and say, there's a parcel for you. And the first time I went in, it was a bit of a tea break, and I went into the parcel office, and there were 3 or 4 of the, perhaps it was 5 station staff sitting around this table with this box in the middle, polystyrene box, covered in red and yellow stickers, live semen, handled with care. And I walked in and said, I think you've got a parcel for me. And they looked at me, handed this to me as if it was gold. And I can imagine the comments as I walked away with this parcel. We attended Southall Methodist Church, or Southwell as some of the locals call it, a lovely small town, village really, in those days it seemed to me. We ran a youth club at the church, and we had a Sunday evening fellowship for young people at our church. That was quite a sort of interesting stage of involving young people in our lives. Our first son was born there in 1969, and it was the following year, in 1970, I had the opportunity to apply for a job at Kirtley Hall College, which Donald was indicating was where I spent quite a lot of my working life. So I was appointed there actually primarily to teach farm management courses. And I think it was after I went there in 1970, so it must have been about 1971 or 2, I would guess. The principal at the time said to me, I used to take students out visiting farms most weeks. Sometimes it was just to sort of talk to the farmer, be shown around the farm, learn about how they were managing the farm, some of the problems. Other times I would go to a farm that was perhaps for sale, and we'd do a budgeting planning exercise for taking over the farm. But the principal said, oh, there's a young chap I know who's got a tenancy of a farm not long ago called Donald Curry. I'm sure he'd be an interesting farm to visit. So that was how my first meeting occurred of Donald, between Donald and myself. And it's taken him roughly 50 years, I think it must be, to get his revenge on me. We came to live at Wylam when we came to Northumberland from Nottinghamshire, and I've lived there ever since in the same house. So I lived at Wylam. We became involved in the Methodist Church at Wylam, where I'm still involved, and perhaps pursuing that Christian Endeavour pledge as much as I could. I like to be involved in things. I've served in a number of roles within the Methodist Church, church steward, circuit steward in the old days of the Hexham Circuit, which is now the Tynedale Methodist Circuit, which some of you will know. When I was a circuit steward, I thought it would be a good idea to try and get to know some of the more remote churches around the circuit. And one way of doing that, I offered myself as a reader, which I'm still doing after 30-something years. And I better explain, because I know that there are quite a distinction between lay readers in the Anglican Church. As a Methodist reader, I'm provided with a service. Effectively, the sermon is what I use, and I deliver the sermon, and I actually use more modern hymns where I can, rather than those that are set for the service, and I try to rewrite the prayers into something which is more topical. But I'm mentioning this particularly not in any sort of self-gratification way, but to explain that I've learnt more as a reader than I think I've ever learnt as a member of a congregation, listening to sermons. And a week or two ago, I read something in the paper, I hope I've got the figures right, but it said that if you read something, you're likely to remember 70% of it. If you listen to something, you remember 30% of it. And that has had quite a significant impact on me. I have learned more personally by being a reader within the church than I think others have. So that's been a great help to me. Going back to the college went through a rather difficult time. It's in the public record, so I'm not conveying any confidences, but the principal had had his hand in the till and was in prison. The vice principal was going to retire, as were 2 other heads of department, and I realised that I was the only head of department. I should have explained, I've missed out something there. I was promoted within the college to head of agriculture, and ridiculously, and it's one of the problems in a relatively small institution, only a year or 2 later I was actually asked to be director of studies for the whole college, which meant I was organising courses in agriculture, horticulture, woodland management, all sorts of things, animal care, veterinary nursing, and having to monitor those courses. I also was involved, we started some higher national diploma courses at Teesside University in food science and environmental science. So it was a tremendous workload, and as I say, the college was in a difficult time. Our funding had been reduced. These personal things were happening to the staff, and I was about the only person that looked as if I was going to be there. And I said to the management at the time, governors of the college, would it be helpful if I left and you had a clean sheet? And I'm pleased to say they didn't immediately say yes, they did hesitate slightly. Slight reassurance there. And they did say, well, yes, in fact, it would actually be helpful. So in fact, I took early retirement when I was only 58. I should have perhaps said, because this again is something that I think is so valuable in the contacts I've had with people. 4 or 5 of my colleagues, because agriculture was quite a big department in itself, I think I had 20 staff in my department, some dealing exclusively with part-time courses, others with full-time courses. A group of them came to my office one day and they said, we're worried about you, Brian. I said, oh, what's that? What have I done wrong? And they said, well, you haven't done anything wrong specifically, but we can see the pressure you're under. I suppose in a way I was, quite apart from these other jobs I've been officially given, with the vice principal having to act as acting principal with the boss in prison, I was actually covering for the vice principal for some occasions, and they said, the stress it's causing you and the hours you're working, we can see the effect it's having on you, and we don't want you to be made ill by it. And so that encouraged me when the opportunity arose to seek the early retirement I took. I had thought at the time that I might try and get involved with some agricultural consultancy, and a very good friend of mine said, I wouldn't rush into that, give it a while, give it a year or so, which I did. A year later I was so busy with all sorts of other things that the idea of going into consultancy had rather diminished in my mind, and I was very fortunate to be in a position to just accept that I was a retired man and could do other things. One of those things, of course, was to go out with my wife, Kath. We had 3 sons by that time, and so being involved with them a little bit more was very... Kath, I'm going to digress and tell you a very significant part of my story, which is going to be the most difficult to tell. In 1988, Kath was working as a supply teacher at that time. She'd given up teaching for most of the time. Our family was small and growing up, but she was doing some part-time work as a supply teacher. And she said to me one day, I didn't need to steer the car steered itself. And I said, that's ridiculous. I won't go into all the details, but it was the first sign I had that she had developed a mental illness. In those days it was called manic depression. It soon after became known as bipolar disorder. And Kath suffered from it quite severely. After the initial symptoms arose, and we coped with those in a way for a week or 2, I suppose, she was able to receive, reluctantly, because she thought she was absolutely fine and everything was hunky-dory, we managed to get a diagnosis, and she was sectioned and in hospital for about 3 months. At the end of that time, on obviously a high level of medication, she came out of hospital and she coped for a number of years. But these episodes continued to occur from time to time. Kath was, I suppose, on the medication she was on, it changed her personality very significantly. From being a bright, bubbly person, she was much more subdued. But at least it kept the crisis times at bay, and she was never deeply depressed. Anyway, to shorten really a long and protracted story, she was well enough to go back to part-time teaching and some other part-time jobs. In fact, one of the jobs she did, which she absolutely loved, she became an assistant in the occupational health department at Hexham General Hospital, and was involved helping patients in one way or another, and she absolutely loved that. However, as time went on, these episodes began to recur again more frequently and more seriously, and her consultant, who she'd been under for a number of years, suggested that the side effects she was suffering from were more severe than he would have hoped, and he suggested a different type of medication which required her to be weaned off the medication she was on, and he said this might cause another episode. Well, it did, and it was a very severe one, and she was sectioned again and in hospital. She thought our own personal marriage was at an end and our relationship had come to a conclusion. She wouldn't have anything to do with me. She threw her wedding and engagement ring out of the hospital window, I believe, and it was never ever recovered. And so you can imagine it was a very, very difficult time for me. Not that the time was difficult for me, more than it was obviously for her. Suffice to say, she came out of hospital in the early part of 2010 and was on an injectable medication regime where a nurse came to the home and gave her this injection. I think it was every month. And I thought things were better. They were certainly on an even keel. But she did once or twice say, you'd really be better off without me. And I didn't perhaps take that significantly. But to conclude the story, this digression in a way, but such an important part of my life, Kath took her own life when I was out with a walking group that I walked with at that time. I blamed myself, but I also blamed God, because I had been praying for her and for her stability and recovery, and the prayer didn't seem to have been answered. But a few days later, I somehow felt a warmth and support that I hadn't experienced. I don't mean to say I hadn't been supported by friends and family. My 3 sons were supportive. 2 of them were married by that time, and their wives too were supportive. Friends in the village were supportive. Friends at church were supportive. But even so, I was still blaming God and myself for what had happened. And then I felt this strange warmth, as I say. And I'll be perfectly honest, within a week, I had recognised my situation, and I had felt somehow my faith strengthened rather than weakened, and my blaming God diminished, and I thanked God for the way that I was being helped and uplifted in those circumstances. I feel I'm describing this quite inadequately, but you can appreciate it was a very emotional time. And you can perhaps put your own interpretation on this, but I believe that that feeling of additional support has remained with me ever since. It's now 12 years since Kath died, and I still feel that God's hand is in mine when I feel I need it. Just an aside, I should perhaps mention, a friend of mine in Wylam who was on the parish council and also the district council at that time, Philip Brooks, some of you know him, I'm sure, knew him. He died sadly a few years ago. He said to me once before I retired, he said, in Wylam, he said, whenever there's a parish council election, we never have enough people to fill the 8 vacancies. And I remember saying to him, in a place like Wylam, you'd think people would be falling over each other to try and give some support to the village. Well, of course, I hadn't been retired very long when a casual vacancy arose on the parish council, and you can guess who was knocking on my door saying, "How about it, Brian?" And so I put myself forward. There were one or two others that were interested, but I was asked to take this position on the parish council, and it was an immense privilege. I was on the parish council for 20 or so years, acted as chairman for a number of those years, and of course people always think, who are not on the parish council, they think you have lots of power and lots of money, and of course you have neither when it boils down to it. You're dependent on decisions outside the parish council, but nevertheless there were some things we were able to do which were, I think, of benefit to people in the village. And it was a great privilege to serve on the parish council, and through that to be involved in a number of committees outside the parish as well. And so that's part of my life which as well I like to refer to. There's probably, I think, reflecting on my life and career, there are two great lessons that I've learned. One is how important people are to you. I've learned a tremendous lot from colleagues at work, from students, from people at church, people I'm friendly with and know in the village. And it reminds me of something I read about an ex-Roman Catholic Archbishop who said, and I remember when I read it, I thought, how could that be? He said, "I feel there is no one person I have met that does not show me something of God within them." And I'm sure I fail in seeing that in people I meet, especially some particular people, but I like to think that I can learn from people. And I do learn. I'm 84 years old, but I'm learning every day from people I meet in church and elsewhere. And I think that's important. And the other thing, of course, that I was privileged throughout my career was to work in an industry that was working in the natural environment. Okay, farmers are accused of all sorts of things, of damaging the environment, but essentially I find all the farmers I know have the country and their natural environment at heart. And to be able to work in an environment where you're working in God's creation day by day has been an amazing privilege, and one I shall always carry. You may wonder why I've called this talk A Hand to the Plough. It's more metaphorical than physical. My first ploughing experience was an old grey Fergie with a single furrow plough, and I wasn't very good at it, either keeping straight or anything else. And it came home to me this year when I saw the field opposite where I live being ploughed by one of Andrew Graham's men, and there was a 6-furrow reversible plough, and he turned the field over in about 2 hours, I should think. And with the old Fergie plough with one, it would have taken me 2 days, I think. So it's nice to observe those sort of changes. So I still hope that my Christian Endeavour pledge to be more involved in things and be a participant in things still holds, and I try to do that in my day-to-day life. And I've also always been struck by words of Paul to the people of Colossae. It's actually in Colossians chapter 3, verse 23. "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as though you were working for the Lord, not for men." I've always tried to uphold that in my life. Thank you for your patience in listening. That's my story.
Don't wander too far from the mic, Brian. And
If there's any questions.
thank you very well. We've time for a question or a couple. And thank you very much for being so open and even discussing the death of your wife, which has been quite difficult for
It's so much part of my life.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Good.
Well,
Don't forget to put your clocks back.
Brian, I'm not going to let you off that lightly. You told us about your teenage years and your Christian endeavour, and how perhaps your Christian commitment was a bit superficial and peripheral. When did that change?
I think it changed partly, well, significantly. I mean, I never had one of these earth-shattering experiences where I suddenly found God. It's been a progressive thing. But my influence, John Beach was his name. He actually, I don't think I mentioned other than John. He was the chap I met at Hart Bradham's, who was already a deeply committed Christian. And I think it was talking to him and spending time with him that I ought to make a greater commitment. And it was actually, I spoke about the so-called membership of the Methodist Church. It was actually when I was at Worcester doing a one-year course there, where John was as well, that I actually made that commitment.
When you look at agricultural training and education today, Brian, what do you think?
I'm probably not as up to date as I might be, although I still have colleagues or friends who work in agricultural education. Perhaps I can put it this way. A course for which I was tutor at Kirkley Hall for a short time was the National Diploma in Agriculture. Students had done a year on a farm and probably done part-time training during that year. They came into college for a year. They then went out onto a farm for a year where their work was monitored and reported upon and assessed, and then they came back for another year in the college. And they were some of the best students we produced. They were snapped up. I mean, some of them were farmers' sons or daughters and went back to family farms, but those that weren't were much sought after. And I followed the careers of a number of them who have done very well. Now, everything is done in a modular way now. I think they even start with sort of animal care as a sort of generalised title for livestock production, I suppose I might have called it in my day. And everything seems to have been diminished and dumbed down, if that's the right way of putting it. So I'm a little bit alarmed, although I perhaps am not aware of everything that is happening, but that's the sort of trend I think that has happened. So much so that the college where I worked here in Northumberland, agriculture was by far the biggest part of the college activity, with 20 or so staff teaching agriculture. I think they now deal with half a dozen part-time staff that deal with the agricultural courses that they run. To me, so something's gone mad. It's partly the cost of, that's something I might have mentioned. I mean, we used to run sheep shearing courses with 6 or 7 students, which is about all you could really manage on a sheep shearing course. But the powers that be that did our funding said that we shouldn't run any part-time courses of that kind without 15 students. You try taking 15 students sheep shearing. Just mind-boggling.
Well, Brian, thank you very much indeed for your talk. It's been really inspirational, and we all thoroughly enjoyed it. We should have had you there 5 years ago. We shouldn't have waited quite so long to have you as one of our speakers, but thank you very much indeed.